Tonight, drift with me into Victorian Britain, where almost every misery, from a cough to a broken heart, seemed to come with its own little bottle. In a world of coal smoke, aching teeth, bad sleep, and thin walls, relief was everywhere, sitting quietly on bedside tables and behind chemists' counters, waiting to be swallowed, stirred into tea, or trusted far too easily. And that is the strange thing about the Victorian age. People did not simply endure discomfort, they purchased it a cure. If your chest felt tight, there was something for that. If your nerves were frayed, there was something for that. If your child would not sleep, if your husband snored, if your stomach churned, if your mind would not settle, if the day itself felt too heavy to carry to evening, somewhere in the city, there was already a label promising ease. Not health exactly, not safety, certainly, but ease. And once you notice that, the whole century begins to look a little different, softer at the edges, stranger underneath. Tonight, drift with me into Victorian Britain, where almost every misery, from a cough to a broken heart, seemed to come with its own little bottle. In a world of coal smoke, aching teeth, bad sleep, and thin walls, relief sat quietly on bedside tables, in apron pockets, and behind chemists' counters, waiting to be swallowed, dabbed onto the gums, stirred into tea, or trusted far too easily. That is one of the strangest truths about the Victorian age. People did not simply endure discomfort. Very often, they bought something for it. If your chest felt tight, there was a tonic. If your nerves were frayed, there was a tincture. If your child would not sleep, there was a syrup. If your stomach churned, your head throbbed, your thoughts raced, your cough lingered, your mood darkened, or the whole day seemed heavier than it ought to be, somewhere in the city, there was already a neat little label promising relief. Not health, exactly. Not safety, certainly, but relief. A softer body, a quieter mind, a little distance between yourself and whatever was hurting. And perhaps that matters more than any single drug, powder, or cordial we are about to meet. Because the real story is not simply that Victorian remedies could be eccentric, reckless, or surprisingly dangerous. It is that relief itself had become one of the great emotional needs of the age. Life was noisy, crowded, aching, smoky, sleepless, and often unkind in very ordinary ways. The body wore down, the nerves wore thin, privacy was rare, rest was fragile. Even a peaceful evening could be interrupted by carriage wheels, arguing neighbors, a crying infant, a cough from the next room, or the small persistent discomfort of living too close to too many things at once. So the century filled its shelves, not only with medicines in the modern sense, but with drops, draughts, lozenges, cordials, sleeping mixtures, invigorating restoratives, and kindly named elixirs that promised to smooth the rough edges of daily life. Some were meant for pain, some for sleeplessness, some for melancholy, which covered more than anyone quite wished to explain. Some for nerves, a wonderfully flexible diagnosis. Some were for women, some for children, some for overworked men, and many for anyone who simply wanted the world to feel a little less sharp by the time the lamps were lit. You do not need to remember every name tonight. You do not need to keep count of every bottle lined up in the dim glow of a Victorian bedroom, or every remedy offered across a polished wooden counter. You only need to notice the feeling beneath them all. A whole society quietly reaching for comfort, a whole city trying, in one way or another, to be soothed. And once that thought settles in, London begins to make a different kind of sense, because almost every street, bedroom, and chemist's counter is arranged around the same quiet hunger for relief. To understand why Victorian people reached so readily for tonics, drops, powders, and syrups, it helps to look first at the shape of an ordinary day. The room is never entirely quiet. Through the wall comes a cough, a crying child, a chair dragged across bare boards. Outside, Wheels knock over stone, horses stamp in the damp, and somewhere below the window, a door shuts harder than it needs to. Morning arrives with soot on the sill, a chill in the air, and the feeling that the day has already started, without asking whether your body is ready for it. Victorian life could look graceful from a distance. Up close, it was often rough on the nerves and rough on the flesh. Coal smoke drifted into curtains and lungs. Boots rubbed, teeth ached, backs stiffened, hands cracked in the cold. Work repeated itself until the body felt less like a companion and more like something that had to be carried from one end of the day to the other. Even inside respectable homes, there was little softness to spare. Water had to be heated, meals prepared, children managed. Appearances held together, and sleep, when it came at all, was light and easily broken. That is what makes the remedies of the age feel less surprising. Pain was not unusual. Fatigue was not unusual. Irritation, sleeplessness, worry, poor digestion, nerves, coughs that lingered, rooms that smelled stale, streets that sounded too loud, all of it formed the background texture of ordinary life. The body was so often a little cold, a little overworked, a little under-rested, that relief itself began to seem like a kind of daily necessity. And once relief becomes a daily necessity, the bottle on the shelf begins to look different. It no longer looks reckless at first glance. It looks helpful, kind, even a small promise waiting at the chemist's counter, a little easing of the chest, a little quieting of the mind, a little help at bedtime, something for the cough, something for the nerves, something for the child who will not settle, something for the woman who has done too much, something for the man who must get up and do it all again tomorrow. The stranger, the cure sounds, the harsher the day behind it usually was. That is the part worth holding on to as we drift deeper into this world. Not simply the oddity of the medicines, but the constant friction of the lives around them. A century of thin walls, smoky air, repetitive labor, social pressure, and small discomforts that rarely left the body fully alone. In that kind of world, soothing bottles multiply very quickly. So let the noise soften a little now. Let the coal haze hang above the rooftops. Let wet boots pass along the street and fade. Let the sounds inside the house blur into a low domestic murmur. And before the night crowds and opium pipes and glowing tonics arrive, it helps to begin where so many Victorian habits began. At home, at breakfast, with something small dropped into a cup. Morning arrives slowly in this house, though never very kindly. The light at the window is weak and grey, strained through soot on the glass and a sky that looks tired before the day has fully begun. The wallpaper has lifted a little at the seams. The room smells faintly of damp cloth, old ashes and tea, not yet poured. On the table sit a crust of stale bread, a chipped cup, a spoon worn thin with use, and beside them a small brown bottle waiting with such quiet familiarity that it hardly seems strange at all. That is what makes it strange. You do not reach for it with fear. You reach for it the way a tired hand reaches for something already trusted. Outside, a cart rattles over the stones. Somewhere below, a door shuts. In the next room, a child stirs, gives one small restless sound, then settles again. Your jaw aches from a bad tooth. Your sleep was poor. Your nerves already feel a little rubbed raw, though the morning has barely started. And so the bottle comes closer. The spoon tilts, and a few drops disappear into the tea. Laudanum belongs perfectly to this hour. It is for pain, for nerves, for cramping, for coughing, for sleeplessness, for sadness too shapeless to explain, for the dull burden of beginning another day when the body and mind would both prefer not to. It is for the headache that arrived in the night and did not leave with dawn. It is for the woman who has too much to do, the man who must go out into the city, the mother who cannot afford to come undone before breakfast. In such a world, relief does not need to be dramatic to become beloved. It only needs to be near. You stir the cup once, the spoon taps softly against the porcelain, then you drink. The bitterness is there, but only briefly. Warmth follows, not joy, exactly, not even true comfort, something gentler and more forgiving than that. The ache in your jaw seems to step back a pace. The hard edge of your thoughts softens. The room remains what it was a moment ago. Worn table, weak light, tired wallpaper, but now it feels slightly farther away, as though a thin layer of mist has settled between you and everything that was pressing too closely against your nerves. That is all laudanum really has to do. It does not need to fix the house. It does not need to clean the air, improve the street, repair the tooth, shorten the workday, or guarantee sleep tonight. It only needs to make the day feel more carryable than it did 10 minutes earlier. And because it can do that, it slips very easily into routine. A little for the tea, a little for the pain, a little because yesterday was tiring and today looks no better. A little because the weather is damp, a little because the child was up half the night, a little because there are visitors coming, a little because there is laundry, or grief, or a cough, or the familiar private misery of simply being alive in a body that never seems fully rested. Soon the bottle is no longer a novelty. It is part of the household rhythm. It waits near the cup and kettle. It returns to the table at dusk. It sits near the mantel, or in the cupboard among other practical things, as if it belongs there by right. The most unsettling drug is often the one that feels the most ordinary, not the one hidden in a den, not the one whispered about in scandal, but the one standing quietly beside the breakfast tea, respectable as the spoon, useful as the fire. Outside, London is already asking too much. The wheels, the soot, the labor, the errands, the noise, the small humiliations of crowded life. But inside this room, the child has gone quiet again. The kettle gives one last faint sigh. The cup is warm in your hands. Even the stale bread looks less accusatory than it did a few minutes ago. Nothing has been cured. Nothing has been solved. And yet the morning has been dimmed into something softer. That is the true power of laudanum here, not spectacle, not shock, a domestic ritual that turns suffering into something foggier, and therefore easier to carry. You sit a moment longer at the table. The light remains pale. The bottle remains still. Another spoonful could always be justified later. Another difficult hour could always be softened. And once that kind of comfort has found a home beside the bread and tea, it no longer feels like an intrusion. It feels like part of the day itself. And yet the private bottle by the breakfast cup was only one version of relief, because beyond the front door the city offered darker rooms, stranger company, and softer ways to disappear. By evening the city has changed its texture. Above ground, wheels still pass over the stones and footsteps still brush the pavement, but the noise feels farther away now, softened by damp air and gathering dark. Somewhere behind a narrow door, below a stair, or up one dim flight, there is another room waiting. You slip inside, and the curtain falls back into place behind you. At once the street is gone. The change is less dramatic than it is heavy. Sound dulls, light lowers. The air is thick with smoke, lamp oil, stale cloth, and the tired breath of too many people staying too long in too little space. Nothing here is elegant. The wallpaper is worn. The sofa sinks in the middle. The table bears old rings from old cups, and yet the room feels softer than the world outside, as if it has been built for one purpose only, to let the day loosen its grip. An opium den is easier to understand when you stop imagining scandal and start imagining exhaustion. A man lies back on the sofa with his hands folded over his coat, not asleep exactly, just no longer committed to being fully present. Two others sit near the wall, speaking in slow half-sentences that never seem to mind whether they reach an ending. Someone turns a cup in careful circles on the table. Someone coughs once into the dimness. A match gives a brief hiss. Then the room settles again. What makes the place seductive is not glamour, though there is a little of that in the shadows if you look for it. A frayed velvet arm, a brass lamp turned amber, a ring catching the light on a limp hand. No, the deeper comfort is simpler. No one in this room expects you to keep up appearances. Outside, you must answer quickly, stand properly, keep moving, keep talking, keep being somebody. Inside, all of that begins to loosen. A pipe passes from one hand to another. It is sticky with use, familiar with repetition, and handled with the sleepy care of a ritual that no longer needs explaining. A breath is taken, a pause follows, and then the world seems to move one step farther away. Not gone, just softened. That is the feeling that fills the room. Thoughts still arrive, but at a distance. A debt, a letter, a memory from home, the shape of tomorrow. Each one drifts near, then loses its edge in the smoke. Time loosens with it. 10 minutes might be an hour might be most of the evening. Nobody seems interested in correcting the difference. Victorian escape was not always lonely. Sometimes it was communal. That may be the saddest thing about the room, and the kindest. These are not always grand failures or flamboyant sinners. Very often they are simply tired people sharing the same blur. A low companionship forms around that, not cheerful, not intimate, but real, the companionship of strangers who are grateful that, for a little while, no one is asking them to be brisk, clever, polished, or strong. Of course, there are risks. A pocket may feel lighter when you leave. A coin may vanish. The sofa is cleaner in the dark than it would be by morning. The cough in the corner is not especially reassuring. But even those small dangers seem to move slowly here, wrapped in the same haze as everything else. Listen closely, and the room almost lulls itself. Glass clinks softly. A match whispers into flame. Somewhere near the door, fabric brushes wood. Above, from the world still carrying on without you, carriage wheels roll by in distant, muffled bursts. The whole place exhales in long intervals, as if everyone inside has agreed to stop trying for the night. And that is why the den draws people in, not because it is glamorous, and not even because it is especially hidden, but because it offers one rare luxury in a demanding city. A room in which nothing much is required of you. You sit a little deeper. Your shoulders slacken. The smoke blurs the lamplight. The day recedes for a while. Forgetting feels less like a fall than a shared arrangement. But not every Victorian wanted to sink. Some wanted the opposite. They wanted their pain numbed, their speech sharpened, their confidence restored, and their face ready to survive the dentist. By the later years of the century, relief had begun to look brighter. Not softer, and not especially gentler, but neater, brisker, more modern in its little promises. If laudanum belonged to the breakfast table and opium to the dim room where the day was allowed to collapse, then cocaine arrived under cleaner light. It belonged to the chemist's counter, the dentist's chair, the tidy bottle, the confident tone of a new remedy that seemed less like surrender and more like progress. And perhaps that was part of its charm. The easiest place to understand it is the mouth. A bad tooth has a way of swallowing the whole day. Tea becomes unpleasant. Bread becomes work. Even speaking feels like an unnecessary risk. You delay the dentist for as long as pride allows. And then, at last, you sit in the chair beneath the poor gray light of the window, while instruments wait nearby with more confidence than you feel. Then something remarkable happens. A little cocaine is applied to the gums, and the pain begins to move away from you. Not vanish entirely perhaps, but loosen. The mouth goes numb. The fear slackens. The whole business, which had seemed unbearable a moment earlier, becomes oddly manageable. In a century so full of discomfort, that kind of swift and practical mercy must have felt almost miraculous. And once a thing can do that, people rarely leave it in one corner of life for long. If it can quiet pain, perhaps it can sharpen a dull afternoon. If it can help with the dentist, Perhaps it can help with awkwardness too, with tiredness, with nervous conversation, with the dreadful strain of arriving at a dinner table, already exhausted and still being expected to look alert, agreeable, and mildly charmed by everyone around you. So the little bottle begins to travel, not only through surgeries and chemists' shops, but into parlors, visiting hours, social evenings, and the long practical theater of respectable life. A discreet medicinal touch before an engagement, a little help before a tiring day, something to brighten the edges of work, to lift the heavy mood, to make the tired face feel slightly more equal to its duties. What begins as medicine for pain quickly becomes medicine for performance. And performance mattered. The century asked people to endure discomfort politely, to keep appointments, to answer well, to stay useful, to sit through conversation, office hours, family visits, formal dinners, social obligations, and all the other little tests of energy and composure that filled a Victorian week. In that kind of world, a substance that did not simply dull suffering but turned it, however briefly, into momentum could seem wonderfully efficient. That is the deeper appeal of cocaine here. Not only that it numbs, but that it seems to improve. It promises a version of the self that is more capable, more buoyant, more presentable. A person who can survive the dentist, then continue through the afternoon with a polite smile. A person whose nerves are quieter, whose fatigue is less obvious, whose conversation comes a little more readily. Not cured, exactly, just upgraded enough to get through the room. There is something faintly absurd in that, and very Victorian. A society already crowded with remedies for pain now discovers one that may also improve its manners. The chemist's shelves gleam softly in the light. Labels stand in neat rows. Coats are brushed, gloves are straightened, smiles appear on cue. And somewhere beneath all that careful surface, chemistry is being asked to help people seem a little more effortless than they really feel. After the darker hush of the opium room, this world is brighter, tidier, and more alert. But the longing underneath it is the same: relief. Yes, but relief that can still stand upright in public. Relief that looks composed. Relief that helps a person keep going. And for a while, perhaps it does. The jaw quiets. The afternoon sharpens. The conversation becomes easier to survive. The body, so often experienced as a tired and inconvenient thing, feels briefly more cooperative. But evening always waits at the edge of that brightness, and eventually even the most efficient remedy must hand the body back to the older problem of the night. Because after stimulation came the more familiar difficulty of Victorian life, the soot, the noise, the anxious mind, and the stubborn fact that sleep did not come easily. Night gathers itself differently inside a Victorian home. By now, the fire has lowered, the lamp flickers in its glass. The room is smaller than it seemed in daylight, and less forgiving. Bedding rustles, a board creaks in the passage, somewhere beyond the wall. A voice rises, then drops again. Outside, carriage wheels still trouble the street from time to time, and the air that slips in through the window frame carries a little coal smoke, a little damp, and the faint, lingering trace of boiled cabbage from some nearby kitchen that has not quite let the evening go. You have done what the day required. You have endured its noises, its small irritations, its social demands, its tiredness. And yet now, when rest should come naturally, the mind refuses to loosen. Thoughts keep their grip. The body is weary, but not peaceful. The pillow is cool, then warm, then somehow wrong again. You turn once, then once more. The blanket settles around your legs, but not your nerves. Even the clock seems too alert, measuring the room 1 small second at a time. This was one of the quieter miseries of the century. A person could survive the dentist, survive the smoke, survive the street, survive dinner, survive the duties of home and work and appearances. and still find that the final threshold of the day would not open. Sleep did not always arrive just because it was wanted. The city lingered in the body, the noise lingered, the strain lingered, the mind, overstimulated by too much life in too little space, kept one eye open long after the lamp had been turned low. And so another bottle found its place indoors, not on the breakfast table this time, and not in a dim public room, but at the bedside, close to the spoon, the water glass, the folded handkerchief, the prayer book, the hairbrush, the small private objects that witness the end of the day. Chloral Hydrate belonged to that world. It carried itself differently from other remedies. Less smoky, less scandalous, more modern, more respectable. It did not ask to be whispered about. It asked only to be taken properly and allowed to do its work. That was part of its appeal. The age could invent new wakefulness, but what people wanted most was still rest. A measured spoonful, a swallow, then waiting, not dramatic waiting, not the theatrical hush of danger or the bright lift of stimulation. The quieter kind, the sort in which the room does not change all at once, but gradually loses its insistence. The pillow feels less argumentative, the blankets grow heavier in a pleasing way. The ticking clock is still there, but it no longer seems to land so sharply. The traffic outside thins into a distant murmur. The neighbors, whether they are speaking, coughing, or dragging furniture for reasons best known to themselves, begin to fade into the background like weather passing over a far roof. Your eyelids grow slower. That may be the most merciful part of it. Not sleep itself at first, but the soft unfastening that comes before it. The body giving up its day, the mind no longer racing to stay abreast of every unfinished thought. The room receding by small degrees, until the bed becomes the most convincing place in the world, and the city, for once, seems to have taken a step backward. Chloral Hydrate offered a dream that would have seemed almost luxurious to many Victorians. Not pleasure, not brilliance, not energy, but unconsciousness without interruption. No speeches to make, no callers to receive, no streets to cross, no posture to maintain, just the possibility of slipping below the level of noise and staying there a while. In Victorian life, the miracle was often not excitement, but the chance to be unconscious in peace. So the bottle remained near at hand, not as a symbol of vice, but as one more neat domestic solution to the stubborn fact that modern life had made people tired without making them calm. Respectable enough to sit beside routine, efficient enough to be trusted, a little bedside chemistry to escort the overworked mind where prayer, fatigue, and patience had failed to lead it. Now the blanket settles more completely. The pillow holds. Your breathing slows without being told to. The lamp has become only a softened glow through its glass. The corners of the room blur. Even the air feels thicker, kinder, less eager to disturb. Beyond the house, London still exists, of course, with all its smoke and clatter and sleepless industry. But from here it seems farther away than it did an hour ago, as if the whole city has finally drifted one room farther from your bed. And once sleep enters the story, the household changes too, because adults are not the only ones expected to become quieter, calmer, and easier to manage. In the middle of the night, a Victorian home could feel very small. The lamp has been turned low, but not low enough. Shadows tremble on the wall. The air is close with wool blankets, stale heat, and the tired smell of a room that has been awake too long. From the cradle, or the narrow bed, or the little corner where the child has been laid down and lifted up and laid down again, the crying continues in waves, not always loud, but constant enough to wear through the nerves of everyone listening. A mother has already risen 3 times. A father, if he is home, has already turned on the pillow and tried not to sound impatient. Someone in the next room coughs. A floorboard gives its thin complaint. The house itself seems to be listening, tense and sleepless. as though one restless child could pull an entire household out of whatever piece it had nearly managed to find. And in homes where work begins early, where rooms are crowded, where privacy is scarce and help is thin, peace is not a small thing. It is precious. So the little bottle is fetched, perhaps from the medicine chest, perhaps from a cupboard near the stove, perhaps from the shelf where all the household mercies are kept together. Cough mixtures, cordials, drops for nerves, something for the father's chest, something for the mother's pains, something for the child's teething, and another bottle. No one fully remembers buying, but everyone trusts because it has been there a long time. The label promises relief, quieting, rest, gentle sleep. The words are chosen with great kindness. That is part of what makes this corner of the story so tender and so sad. The child is not wicked. The parents are not cold. The home is simply tired. The spoon is small. The hand holding it is careful. The child turns away once, fusses, cries again, then finally swallows. The rocking begins once more. The chair creaks in a slow, familiar rhythm. A tiny hand unclenches. The crying weakens, then breaks apart into little breaths, then fades almost all at once, as if someone has drawn a curtain across the noise. And the silence that follows can feel holy, not grand, not joyful, just holy in the way relief sometimes is when it arrives in a room that has been strained to its limit. The weak lamp burns on. The parent keeps rocking for another minute, perhaps two, unwilling to trust the quiet too quickly. Then at last the chair stills. The child is warm and heavy now, the face softened, the lashes resting quietly against the skin. Somewhere behind the tiredness comes the first real breath the adult has taken in hours. From a distance this can sound harsh, but in the moment, it often looked like mercy. A teething baby, a feverish child, a cough that would not stop, a house where one cry wakes 3 siblings, one grandmother, and a man who must be up before dawn, a mother who has done all she can with rocking, humming, patience, and frayed nerves. What sounds cruel from a distance often looked in the moment like an act of kindness performed by people too tired to imagine anything gentler. That is why these remedies settled so deeply into family life. Not only soothing syrups, but cough drops, sleep draughts, calmatives, little medicines for little bodies, each one wrapped in the language of care. The Victorian household did not seek silence because it lacked feeling. It sought silence because feeling had already been stretched thin by labor, overcrowding, poor sleep, constant illness, and the heavy practical work of getting everyone through another week. And once such remedies entered the home, they rarely belonged to children alone. The medicine chest became its own small portrait of the family. Something for teething, something for coughs, something for pain, something for nerves, something for sleeplessness, something to settle the stomach, something to steady the hands, something to dull what had become too sharp, a spoon for the child, a dose for the mother, a comforting drop for the grandfather, a lozenge for the sister with a sore throat, a little help for everyone, because almost everyone was carrying some small misery that needed softening. In that way, the household itself began to move around remedies. The cupboard door opens, the bottle is uncorked, the spoon is wiped and used again. Someone measures carefully, someone guesses, the kettle mutters on the hob, a cough fades in the next room, footsteps cross the floor more gently now. Mindful of the new quiet, the whole house adjusts itself around the delicate hope that sleep, once regained, might hold until morning. That hope could be overwhelming. A sleeping child meant a sleeping house. A sleeping house meant steadier hands tomorrow, less strain, less temper, less despair disguised as irritation, a few more hours in which no one was crying, no one pacing, no one begging the night to end. It is difficult to overstate how valuable that would have felt in a century where exhaustion so often sat at the center of domestic life. And so these remedies remained what they appeared to be. Kindness in a bottle, care in a spoon, tenderness made practical. That was the visible truth of them. The more troubling truth sat just underneath, quiet as ever, because the most haunting remedies were often sold as kindness. Still, in the half-dark, what the room remembers first is not danger. It remembers relief, the rocking chair slowing to stillness, the weak lamp burning beside the bed, the faint crease of worry smoothing from a parent's forehead, tiny hands at rest above a blanket, the hush settling over the boards, the creak of the house becoming softer, almost protective. At last the room sounds like sleep again, and once a family has tasted that kind of silence, it is easy to understand why the bottle keeps its place on the shelf. But homes did not only seek quiet outside those walls. Relief also traveled to parties, surgeries, taverns, and evenings where respectability frayed just enough to become entertaining. By evening, respectability had usually begun to loosen a little. Curtains were drawn, lamps were lit in one part of the city. Guests gathered in warm sitting rooms where the talk had gone on just long enough to become tiring. In another, a gin shop filled with damp coats, sore feet, and the weary hope that a glass might make the night feel shorter. And in between those worlds, Victorian relief moved through the air in stranger forms, not only poured, but breathed. Even joy, in this era, often came pre-mixed with anesthesia. Ether was the oddest version of that evening escape. It had begun in medicine, where it could hush the body enough for surgery or dentistry, but it did not stay there. It drifted into demonstrations, student experiments, parties, and those faintly unruly gatherings, where respectable boredom was only one novelty away from mischief. A bottle appeared, a handkerchief was touched with it, a breath was taken, and the room changed by degrees. The carpet seemed softer, the air lighter. Laughter came too easily to be entirely earned. Someone grew unreasonably pleased with their own thoughts. Someone else leaned back and let posture dissolve for a while. That was ether's peculiar charm. It did not simply amuse. It loosened the burden of being observed in a society so full of manners, self-command, and quiet assessment. Even a small chemical blur could feel like mercy. A serious face became foolish. A shy guest felt briefly less trapped inside shyness. The evening, which had required effort a moment before, became softer around the edges. Not better, exactly, just easier to inhabit. Gin offered a rougher version of the same relief. It did not arrive disguised as progress. It waited in the bottle, in the chipped glass, in the narrow room where tired people went after a long day of being cold. Watched, underpaid, or disappointed. The light was poorer there. The talk was less polished. The first mouthful burned, then spread warmth through a body already worn thin by work and noise. It was not refinement. It was softening, a little courage, a little numbness, a little distance between yourself and the fact of your own exhaustion. That is what links ether and gin beneath their obvious differences. Neither merely created pleasure, both made people temporarily less answerable to pain, to embarrassment, to class pressure, to the strain of having to remain composed while life pressed too hard. Victorian life demanded performance in drawing rooms, taverns, workplaces, and family circles alike. Vapor helped some people survive the role. Drink helped others. Often the wish underneath was the same, not ecstasy, but relief from the effort of being fully present. And once that is understood, the social comedy of the age becomes gentler to look at. A handkerchief passed with a conspiratorial smile, a guest laughing too long at nothing in particular, a laborer warming both hands around a glass, a woman at last sitting down after standing all day, the lamp burning lower, the room growing warmer, slower, less exact. Even amusement becomes drowsy after a while. Voices soften, chairs take more weight, glasses cool in the hand. What remains is not gaiety, so much as the body leaning gratefully into temporary numbness. And perhaps the most Victorian version of all was the chemist's counter itself, because nowhere else did hope, marketing, desperation, and fantasy stand so neatly in rows. Step with me now into the chemist's shop, where Victorian hope was arranged in rows. The bell at the door gives a modest little sound as you enter, and at once the room closes around you in warm shadow, glass reflections, polished wood, and the faint mingled scent of herbs, alcohol, dust, sugar, and something medicinal that seems too old to belong to any one bottle alone. Shelves rise behind the counter in neat ranks, drawers line the walls. Labels tilt toward the lamplight. Red, amber, green, and clear glass catch the glow as if each bottle contains not merely a remedy, but a private promise. It is hard not to be impressed. The chemist's shop is half pharmacy, half theatre. It offers order in a world where discomfort is usually shapeless. A headache can become something named, a sadness can be addressed, a weakness can be fortified, a restless night can be soothed, a nervous disposition, a sluggish digestion, a female complaint, a low mood, a troublesome cough, an irritable child, a tired husband, a worn-out mother. All of it can be met with a bottle, a tonic, a cordial, a powder, a draught, a restorative, a cleanser, a syrup, each one neatly labeled, as though the disorder of living might be coaxed into submission by good handwriting and a proper cork. That was part of the magic. To name a discomfort is to make it seem more manageable. To choose a remedy is to feel, for a moment, less helpless before the body and its many small rebellions. And so people stood at these counters with symptoms both clear and vague, asking for relief in language that was often softer than the suffering itself. Nerves, weakness, a touch of melancholy, poor sleep, female troubles, strain, low spirits, indigestion, the after-effects of weather, work, grief, overthinking, under-resting, or simply existing too long in a city that rarely let the body settle completely. The chemist, with all his drawers and bottles and measured calm, made this feel answerable. Around him stood the remedies themselves, bright and persuasive. Patent medicines were among the most theatrical of all Victorian inventions. Their labels made grand claims in elegant type. Their advertisements promised restoration, vigor, calm, purity, appetite, clarity, cheerfulness, sleep, and renewed constitution. Some came endorsed by doctors, some by testimonials, some by the floating authority of print, which in that age could make almost anything seem reasonable if it sounded confident enough. A bottle might promise to invigorate the liver, cleanse the blood, restore feminine balance, strengthen the nerves, settle the bowels, lift the mind, sharpen the appetite, or quiet the child. It might contain alcohol, opiates, stimulants, sugar, herbs, cleansers, or some unstable alliance of several at once. It might work beautifully for half an hour. It might do very little. It might do far too much. But in the moment of purchase, what mattered most was often the feeling that something had been selected, named, and brought home in your hand. That feeling was powerful, because life was not merely painful in large ways. It was inconvenient in endless small ones, a dragging fatigue, a hot face in company, a stomach that refused breakfast, a cough that returned at dusk, a gloom that sat in the chest for days without becoming dramatic enough to count as tragedy. People wanted a named remedy, not only because they believed in chemistry, but because they wanted their discomfort to have a shape. Once it had a shape, perhaps it could be managed. Once it had a bottle, perhaps it could be softened. So the shelves in ordinary homes began to resemble smaller versions of the shop itself. A family medicine cupboard could become a quiet portrait of its owners. Something for nerves, something for sleep, something for coughs, something for pain, something for the stomach, something for the child, something for the mother, something left over from last winter, something bought because the label sounded convincing. Something never quite finished because nobody remembered what it had originally been for, only that it seemed useful to keep. Relief accumulated this way, bottle by bottle, until domestic life itself began to feel organized around the possibility that one more cordial, one more powder, one more spoonful might finally match the exact contour of the problem. And belief, so often, stood very close beside the liquid in the glass. In Victorian medicine, belief was often part of the active ingredient, not because the remedies were imaginary, many were strong enough to prove otherwise, but because reassurance had its own force, the choosing, the measuring, the uncorking, the taking, the waiting. All of it formed a ritual around uncertainty. It told the sufferer, this has been noticed, this has been named, this can be addressed. Even before the tonic touched the lips, part of its work had already begun. That is why the chemist's shop matters so much in this story. It sells more than chemicals. It sells explanation. It sells order. It sells the calming illusion that discomfort can be matched, 1-to-1, with a remedy standing patiently on a shelf. It offers ritual to the overwhelmed, precision to the vague, and hope to anyone tired of being told to simply endure. In a century so full of ache, strain, nerves, and interrupted rest, that kind of reassurance was almost irresistible. So linger here a moment longer. Look at the lamplight resting on the shoulders of the bottles. Let the labels blur slightly in the warm shadow. Hear the quiet movement behind the counter, the soft slide of a drawer, the tiny knock of glass against wood, the hush of shoes on the floorboards. A cork is lifted, a measure is poured, a parcel is wrapped, relief is chosen with intimate seriousness, as though the body's mysteries might finally be persuaded into calm by this small evening ceremony. And after wandering through all those claims and colors, the mind almost begins to crave something simpler. Not a cure exactly, but the comforting idea that relief can still look refined, elegant, and socially acceptable. Before going any further, it helps to pause and notice the pattern that has been gathering quietly beneath all these bottles, vapors, syrups, and glasses. The Victorians did not always seek intoxication. Very often, what they wanted was something gentler in appearance and easier to excuse. Something respectable, something deniable, something that could sit on a bedside table, in a medicine cupboard, or behind a polished counter without looking like surrender. A comfort that still wore good manners, a remedy that could pass as prudence, a little help that did not require a person to admit, even to themselves, how worn down they really were. And that wish is easier to understand than it may first appear. Most people were not chasing wild visions or dramatic collapse. More often they wanted smaller mercies, to sleep through the noise, to stop hurting, to stop coughing, to stop blushing in company, to steady the hands before a social call, to quiet the baby, to survive the dentist, to get through dinner, to make it through work, to sit in a room without feeling every nerve in the body pulled too tight. These are not extravagant desires. They are ordinary wishes of an ordinary body asking, in its own stubborn way, for less discomfort. That is what makes this whole world feel softer when looked at from the right distance. The laudanum on the breakfast table, the hush of the opium room, the bright, neat promise of cocaine at the dentist, the spoonful of sleep at bedtime, the syrup given to a crying child, the glass in the tavern, the bottle chosen under the chemist's lamp, all of them begin to belong to the same emotional landscape. They are different in form, different in class, different in mood, but the longing underneath them keeps repeating. A quieter chest, a calmer mind, a more manageable evening, a little distance from pain, a little less effort required to be a person. And perhaps that is the most useful way to hold this part of the story. Not as a parade of eccentric substances, but as a long Victorian search for relief that could still look proper while doing its work. Relief that did not need to announce itself as weakness. Relief that could hide inside routine, inside etiquette, Inside medicine, inside care, inside the ordinary little ceremonies of domestic and social life. Because the unifying drug in this story is not opium, or gin, or cocaine. It is relief itself that is the thing being poured, swallowed, dabbed, stirred, measured, passed across counters, tucked into cupboards, kept near beds, and trusted just a little too easily. Relief is the true constant. Relief is the need that makes each bottle seem reasonable for a while. Relief is the dream that turns chemistry into comfort and habit into ritual. So let the pace soften here. Let the shoulders drop a little. Let the jaw unclench. Let the room grow quieter around the thought. The curiosity that carried us through strange remedies and stranger customs can settle now into something gentler, something closer to understanding. These people were not always trying to be reckless. Very often they were trying to be bearable to themselves. They were trying to make the body less loud, the mind less crowded, the night less long. And once you see that clearly, the whole century changes shape. It becomes less a cabinet of oddities and more a portrait of tired human beings reaching, again and again, for whatever might soften the edges of living. Some reached carefully, some carelessly, some respectfully, some desperately. But the motion was often the same, away from discomfort, toward ease, toward the hope that one could still remain dignified while asking for help from a bottle. And with that softer frame in place, the story can move into its most Victorian combination of all. Vanity, status, chemistry, and the hope that danger might still look beautiful in the mirror. The room is lit for evening, not for truth. Candlelight settles kindly over the dressing table. It catches the rim of the mirror, the handle of a brush, the pale wrist above an unfastened glove. A gown waits on the chair. An invitation lies open beside a powder jar. Somewhere below, wheels pass in the street, and somewhere farther off, another household is also preparing to be seen. Here, before the evening begins, the body is being adjusted. That was often the quiet ambition of Victorian beauty. Not only adornment, but correction. The skin must look smoother, paler, finer, less touched by weather, work, or appetite than ordinary life would usually allow. To appear untouched by sunlight and labor was more than a fashion. It was a class signal. A face that seemed delicate and carefully preserved suggested leisure, softness, and distance from the rougher facts of living. So the dressing table became a small private laboratory. A packet promising pallor, a drop for the eyes, a powder for the complexion, a cream to improve what nature had left too plainly visible. None of it sounded crude when set out this way. The language was always gentler than the reality. Brighten, refine, clarify, perfect. The goal was not merely beauty, but the illusion of being above ordinary bodily life. That is why arsenic could seem persuasive. It did not arrive first as poison. It arrived as possibility, a paler face, a more refined complexion, a look of delicacy that suggested wealth rather than labor, candlelight rather than sunlight, drawing rooms rather than fields or factories. Belladonna offered its own promise, widening the eyes into something softer and stranger. Powders and creams smoothed and whitened, mercury and lead slipped into routine under prettier names and better manners. The emotional engine underneath all this was not vanity alone. It was pressure, competition, the knowledge that appearance could shape how a room received you. A woman before the mirror was not simply decorating herself. She was managing status, signaling refinement, and trying to make the body tell a more flattering story than life usually did. And in that kind of culture, danger could become elegant very quickly. Poison becomes persuasive when it offers status, polish, and the feeling of having escaped the common body. The body was not only treated in Victorian life, it was curated, corrected, and quietly poisoned. Still, the room remains hushed while it happens. Powder drifts in candlelight. Silk rustles softly at the waist. A brush passes once more across the skin. Breath slows before the final glance into the mirror. Outside, the carriage may already be waiting. Inside, the face is almost finished now. Pale, composed, and ready for the evening to believe in it. And from the mirror, it is only a short distance to the absinthe glass. Because the same age that wanted to polish the body also wanted to elevate the mind, or at least persuade itself that intoxication might count as inspiration. By late evening, the city begins to divide into its different kinds of darkness. There is the domestic dark of curtained windows and tired households settling into bed. There is the public dark of damp streets, closing shops, and wheels moving more slowly over the stones. And then there is the softer, more theatrical darkness of the cafe or bar room, where artists, poets, drifters, and people who would very much like to be mistaken for one of those three gather under low light and begin turning drink into atmosphere. This is where absinthe belongs, not in the hurried daylight world of practical remedies, but in the hour when conversation grows decorative and the mind, already worn from the day, becomes willing to believe that a different sort of consciousness might be waiting in the bottom of a glass. The room is warm with bodies and smoke. A lamp glows through its shade. A napkin lies half-folded beside an unfinished sketch. Someone has been speaking earnestly for several minutes about beauty, despair, or punctuation. No one has entirely followed the argument, but the mood is right, and that matters more. Then the drink arrives. It is green in a way that feels almost deliberate, as if someone has decided that ordinary liquor is not enough, and the evening requires something with a little more myth inside it. A glass is set down. A spoon rests over the rim. A sugar cube waits above the liquid. Water is poured slowly, and the drink clouds as it changes, turning pale and opalescent, softening before your eyes into something that looks less mixed than conjured. That ritual is part of the charm. Absinthe is never only swallowed. It is prepared, watched, anticipated. It gives a person time to imagine what kind of evening might follow. A little brilliance, perhaps, a little courage, a little release from the dull shape of ordinary thought. The legends surrounding it only deepen the effect. The green fairy, sudden inspiration, heightened feeling, strange clarity, beautiful nonsense that feels, for half an hour, very much like truth. Whether every myth was chemically accurate mattered less than what people wanted the drink to mean. And what they wanted, very often, was transformation. Not perfect health, not respectable rest, not even simple pleasure, but the sense that the mind could be tilted into a more interesting position, that fatigue might become poetry, that loneliness might become atmosphere, that muddled emotion might become art in rooms like this, with the glass glowing softly and the voices turning slower and more self-important. Absinthe offered permission to feel altered in a way that seemed not merely indulgent, but somehow elevated. Some Victorian relief arrived disguised as creativity. That is why absinthe settled so neatly into artistic fantasy. A man with an unfinished manuscript could believe he was not stuck, merely waiting for the proper state of mind. A painter with too many thoughts and too little discipline could call the feeling inspiration once it had passed through the ritual of the spoon and glass. A woman tired of being sensible all week could sit under the low light, lift a cloudy green drink, and allow the evening to loosen her into something softer, stranger, and less answerable to ordinary life. The attraction was not simply intoxication, it was atmosphere. The bar itself helped with that. The soft glow on the glass, the smoky corners, the slow voices from the next table. The napkin marked with a few lines that may or may not be the beginning of something important. The bartender polishing the same spot with unhurried patience. Outside, the city cooling into shadow. Inside, the room holding its own warm little world together for another hour. In such a place, transformation feels almost plausible. A drink becomes a ritual becomes a mood becomes a story a person tells about themselves. Not drunk perhaps, but inspired, not escaping, exactly, but refining perception, not avoiding the ordinary world, only stepping a little to the side of it, where things seem more vivid, more mysterious, more worth saying aloud. That is the true habitat of absinthe. It thrives where people are less interested in health than in becoming someone slightly more enchanted than they were before. Someone whose thoughts feel deeper, whose words arrive more musically, whose weariness can be mistaken for artistic sensitivity. The drink does not need to fulfill every promise made on its behalf. It only needs to make ordinary consciousness feel, for a little while, less flat and more magical. And after a while, even that magic grows gentle. The conversation loosens into murmurs. The glow in the glass lowers, a hand rests beside it, no longer gesturing so urgently. A chair takes more weight. The room softens around the edges, becoming less a stage for brilliance than a shelter for tired people who wanted the night to feel beautiful before it ended. The city outside continues on in darkness, but from here it seems almost cooled, as if distance itself has become part of the drink. And not every extravagant cure lived in bohemian corners. Some arrived in neat medicine bottles again, wearing the clean face of respectability while reaching toward even stranger extremes. By this point in the century, the chemist's cabinet begins to feel almost limitless in its confidence. The bottles are still neat, the labels are still calm. A person may still ask, quite politely, for something to settle the nerves, ease the chest, improve the spirits, strengthen the body, or make the evening more bearable. But now the age sounds even more certain of itself, as though chemistry has finally learned how to manage not just illness, but the whole inconvenient human condition. The farther the century advanced, the more confidently it packaged risk as progress. Sometimes that confidence wore a gentle face. Cannabis tincture, for example, could sit in a respectable bottle among the other small domestic mercies of the house. It promised calm rather than scandal, softness rather than spectacle. A spoonful for nerves, for cramps, for social strain, for the long tiring business of remaining polite when the body has already had enough. In such a setting it seemed almost tender, a quiet aid for an overworked mind, and a body that wanted the edges of the evening to feel less sharp. A shawl, a chair by the fire, a measured spoon, and the hope of becoming a little more manageable by bedtime. But the same century that wanted calm also wanted force. So beside the soothing bottle stood the invigorating one. Strychnine, offered in tonic form, reveals just how far Victorian faith in stimulation could go before it noticed it was standing near poison. Yet even this makes emotional sense inside its own exhausted world. People were tired in ways sleep did not always cure. They wanted brighter thoughts, steadier limbs, more stamina for duties that continued whether the spirit felt equal to them or not. If the label sounded strengthening enough, if the bottle looked scientific enough, even absurdity could begin to resemble medicine. Morning might ask for something to sharpen the will, evening for something to settle it again. Then comes the newer confidence of heroin, perhaps the clearest sign that old illusions were learning to wear modern clothes. It arrived not looking rough or shameful, but improved, cleaner, medically refined. It could be offered for coughs, for nerves, for pain, for the weary chest and the tired mind. And because it came wrapped in the language of innovation, it could carry forward many of the same old hopes under fresher branding. Not danger, but progress. Not another risk, but a better solution. A spoonful at the bedside. A neat label, a respectable promise that the body might finally quiet down. That is the through line beneath all three. If something sounded polished enough, modern enough, medically improved enough, society was willing to trust it. The prestige of the bottle mattered almost as much as its contents. Glass, label, dosage, recommendation, all of it worked together to reassure the user that this newest remedy must be wiser than the last. Victorian drug culture reaches one of its strangest points, when danger stops looking disreputable and starts looking refined. And still, after each sharper promise, the same quiet domestic image returns. The cabinet door opening, the spoon laid out, the glass catching firelight. The hope that by nightfall, the body may feel less troublesome than it did at breakfast. Cannabis for softening, strychnine for strengthening, heroin for easing and quieting. Different moods, different labels, different excuses, but the same repeated wish underneath them all. To make life more livable by chemical means, to adjust the self just enough to get through the day or slip more gently through the night. And by now, the strangest part of the story is no longer any single substance. It is the pattern itself, the endlessly repeated wish to make life quieter, softer, brighter, stronger, or easier for just a little while. After so many bottles, powders, tonics, drops, syrups, vapors, and carefully measured spoonfuls, it helps to pull back for a moment and look again at the body underneath them all. Not the label, not the advertisement, not the chemist's promise written in elegant type. The body itself, a body that was often tired before the day had properly begun. A body that breathed soot, carried strain, endured noise, slept lightly, worked too long, and moved through rooms where privacy was scarce and comfort was often fragile. A body with aching teeth, tight lungs, frayed nerves, poor sleep, sore hands, weak light, bad air, and very few ways to ask gently for relief. Seen from that distance, the story changes shape. The Victorians were not simply foolish. They were not uniquely theatrical in their suffering, nor especially absurd in their longing to soften it. They were people living in crowded streets, thin-walled houses, imperfect medicine, heavy routine, and an age that could produce powerful substances faster than it could produce wisdom about them. They had fewer safeguards, fewer warnings, fewer gentle alternatives, and far more daily discomfort than many of us would willingly endure for long. That does not make every remedy wise, but it does make many of them understandable, because what keeps returning beneath all these strange cures is not recklessness for its own sake. It is the wish to sleep, to stop hurting, to quiet the child, to ease the cough, to survive the dinner, to soften the grief, to steady the nerves, to get through work, to make the body feel, if only for a little while, less loud and less difficult to inhabit. The bottles were never the whole story. The need behind them mattered more. And once that becomes clear, the age begins to look less like a cabinet of curiosities and more like something sadder, softer, and more familiar. Human beings met pain with whatever hope they had. They trusted labels because labels offered shape. They trusted routine because routine made danger feel smaller. They trusted the bottle because the bottle stood there, solid and named and available, in a world where relief itself was often uncertain. That is, the true subject underneath everything we have been wandering through tonight. Not bizarre drugs, really, human desperation meeting human hope, a tired mother with a spoon, a sleepless man by the bedside, a bottle chosen under the chemist's lamp, a body asking for less pain, less noise, less effort, less self-consciousness, less night. The details may be Victorian, but the longing is not strange at all. Only the methods were strange, the need was deeply ordinary. And perhaps that is one of the quiet comforts of looking back from here. Our rooms are cleaner now. Our medicines, for all their flaws, are more carefully tested. Labels are clearer, warnings are louder. Soot does not settle over quite so many windows. Miracle poisons are less likely to wait beside the bed, in respectable little bottles. We understand more about dependence, dosage, children, sleep, pain, and the ways a remedy can help and harm at once. So let that thought soften the story a little. Let the shoulders drop. Let the jaw unclench. Let the mind stop sorting every substance into shock and strangeness, and instead rest for a moment with the simpler truth beneath them all. Most people were only trying to make life more bearable in the ways they knew how. And once the past is understood that way, it no longer feels like a parade of oddities. It begins to recede into something sadder, softer, and strangely familiar. Now, at the end of it all, you can let the Victorian world drift a little farther away. The bottles may remain in memory for a while, lined up in dim cupboards and glowing faintly behind the chemist's counter. The labels may linger, the powders, the syrups, the spoonfuls, the careful drops in tea, the hush of the opium room, the polished dentist's chair, the dressing table bright with candlelight, the cloudy green glass in the late bar room. But you do not have to stay there now. You are here, in a quieter room, in a safer century, in a bed that does not need to fear soot on the window or a mystery tonic waiting beside the lamp. If you need relief, it arrives with clearer labels, gentler distance, better warnings, cleaner trust. The world is not perfect. Of course, bodies still ache. Minds still race. Nights still sometimes take their time. But the strange little parade of Victorian remedies can settle now into the past where it belongs. No longer pressing close, only fading at the edges like a dream with too many bottles in it. And when you look back at that world one last time, what stands out is not only the danger. It is the improvisation, an entire culture trying, in 100 different ways, to soften the day. Pain met with tinctures, nerves met with tonics, sleeplessness met with spoonfuls, social strain met with vapor, drink, or the confidence of a neat little bottle, vanity met with powders and poisons, fatigue met with stimulants, childhood restlessness met with syrup, the chemist, the nursery, the tavern, the drawing room, the bedside table, all of them joined by the same quiet wish that life might become, even briefly, more manageable than it had been an hour before. That is what you have really been walking through tonight. Not simply a cabinet of bizarre drugs, and not only a history of bad ideas, but a social world built around improvised relief. A world shaped by labor, class, noise, illness, advertising, etiquette, anxiety, poor sleep, and the endless human desire to make discomfort feel smaller before the day was over. The substances were real, the risks were real, but the longing inside them was real too, and perhaps that is why this history lingers. Because it is still recognizable, what makes it memorable is not merely that the remedies were dangerous. It is that the hope inside them has not vanished. People still want the same old mercies, a quieter mind, a calmer body, easier sleep, less pain, less embarrassment, less strain, fewer sharp edges between themselves and the life they are trying to carry. Behind every ridiculous remedy was someone who simply wanted to feel better before nightfall. And once that becomes the final thought, the whole story softens again. The mother with the spoon, the patient in the chair, the guest at the parlor table, the laborer with the glass, the woman before the mirror, the sleepless figure by the bedside, all of them, in one way or another, asking for comfort in a language their century happened to provide. You do not need that language tonight. You do not need the tonic, the cordial, the vapor, the draft, the sleeping syrup, the miracle powder, the bright green glass, or the tiny brown bottle. You can let the whole strange century recede. Let the chemist close his drawers. Let the lamp go dim in the boarding house. Let the carriage pass and not return. Let the nursery grow still. Let the tavern voices lower into the dark. Let the mirror cloud over. Let the city itself soften until it becomes only fog and distance. And then, after a while, not even that. Your eyelids can be heavier now. Your jaw can loosen. Your shoulders can sink a little deeper. Your breathing can slow without effort. The room around you can grow quieter than curiosity. and whatever thoughts are still moving can move more slowly now, as if they too are losing interest in staying awake. Because people have always wanted comfort, that part never changed. Only tonight, you are allowed something gentler than they were. Rest without a hidden risk, sleep without a miracle label, relief without a little glass bottle, asking to be trusted. The old world has gone dim. The shelves are closing, the voices are farther away. The city is nearly gone now, and you can simply rest.